So in the first half of this talk, I laid out a framework for thinking about different political contexts and linked it to the framework laid out in the 2018 World Development Report on Learning. In the second part of this talk, what I will do is I will apply this framework to the case study of South Africa, 2 provinces in South Africa, and also contrast that with Kenya. And then I will ask the question, so based on what we learn, what are possible ways forward? Now, why the South African case study? So first, just some incredibly brief background. In some ways, the South African education system post-apartheid is a success story. It's a success story because there were major gains in access and spending that came in the transition from apartheid to democracy, extraordinary shifts in the distribution of spending from elites to the population as a whole, major increases in secondary enrollment. And it's also, by the way, a system in which over 90% of the children are in the public school system. But what makes this South Africa case of particular interest for trying to think comparatively about political contexts are the institutional design that was put in place in the early years of democracy. It was an institutional design that, in a sense, put in place what were the aspirations of many countries around the world, with a very careful alignment of responsibility between the national level, the provincial level, and the school level. In particular, what makes it interesting for us is that responsibility for implementation was located at the level of the province, the state in some countries, the subnational level, and that there are strong variations, as we will see, across those provinces in political context. And beyond that, also significant responsibility was located within that at the level of the school and school governing bodies. So even within a province, you can see variation in performance across schools. So in some sense, thinking about this from an analytic point of view, trying to understand how political context matters, this turns out to offer us a fabulous natural experiment for being able to think systematically about variations in context by province and even by school, and asking how those variations affect performance. Or to put that, and I will fill this out as we go, to put that in the context of the framework that we laid out in the first part of these talks, is what we have in the 2 provinces that are the focus of this, the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape in South Africa. One of those provinces, the Western Cape, can usefully be characterized as rule of law competitive, and the other one is more usefully characterized as personalized and competitive. The details of these, for those that are interested in the book that I highlighted earlier, it's chapters 4 and 5, spell out the background political economy and its implications for governance across these 2 provinces. Now, going further, what makes these so striking as a basis for comparison is that these provinces varied very substantially in their learning outcomes. These data here are data, this is from 2007 actually, the Southern Africa Consortium on Monitoring Education Quality, weighted averages of literacy and numeracy outcomes by percentile in the distribution. As you can see in this, the Western Cape province strongly outperforms the Eastern Cape. As part of the research, we controlled for a whole variety of other socioeconomic determinants of learning outcomes, and these differences remain significant even after you control for those variations in socioeconomic characteristics. And so what we did is we said, so there are differences that are unexplained by socioeconomic characteristics. Let's look for differences in governance, the bureaucracy, these are public school systems, the degree to which that bureaucracy supports learning. And let's ask the question, to what extent can we account for those differences in governance by differences in the political context at the provincial level? So let me take you through that argument. I mean, obviously have to take you through it in brief. I mean, just to summarize where we are, though, using this framework, we're looking at political contexts numbers 2 and number 3, and we're looking at the question of bureaucratic capabilities. How do these 2 different kinds of political contexts You'll see in a moment how you can get such radically different political contexts within the same national level, same country. But how can these two radically different political contexts produce differences in the quality and the performance of the bureaucracy? So let me start here. Let me describe for you the Western Cape bureaucracy. It is a tightly managed top-down bureaucracy. There was continuity in its leadership. The lines of authority are clearly hierarchical, and they're clear, with clear divisions between the political and the bureaucratic realms. Financial and human resources are tightly managed, and actually startlingly impressive when one visits it. Let me say seemingly startlingly impressive when one visits it. There is an online performance management system which is extraordinary in its ability to track learners, to track schools, to attract and to govern and manage implementation. The contrast between that and the Eastern Cape bureaucracy was stark. The Eastern Cape bureaucracy, there was ongoing rapid turnover in the Eastern Cape Department of Education, both the political leadership as well as the top bureaucratic leadership. The lines of authority were quite unclear, the deep blurring between the political and the bureaucratic lines of authority. There were ongoing issues associated with resources and how resources were used in the management and the governance of those resources. And it is all too easy to say, well, now we see the problem. The problem is the Eastern Cape bureaucracy. Let's fix the bureaucracy. The trouble with that, as at this point in these talks has hopefully become clear to you, is that bureaucracies are embedded in context, in broader politics. And here are the three ideas. Will come back at the very end of this again, but here are three of the variables that I introduced in the first part of this talk. There's the variable of inclusion, and as we will see, huge differences between these two provinces in the degree of inclusion. There are also huge differences in these provinces in politics and how power works, and there's huge differences in these provinces in their institutional inheritance, if you like, personalized versus impersonal institutions. To put that another way, what we're talking about in the political differences is this distinction between a top-down logic, which is the Western Cape logic, and a logic of multiple principles. That's the bureaucracy level, and the distinction also between personalized and impersonal rules of the game. So how do these dimensions, the degree of inclusion, the logic of power, and the institutions and institutional inheritance, how do they play out across these two provinces in ways that produce the different learning outcomes? Rather than go into the details, and as I said before, the details are in chapters 4 and 5 of the book, and a synthesis for thinking about those details is in chapter 7 of the book. I'm going to summarize them around differences in these two provinces, if you like, that you can think of through the demand for learning outcomes and the supply side of delivering learning outcomes. So let's take first the demand side. A massive difference between the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape is the size of the middle class. The Western Cape, it's a more affluent economy. It's an economy which has quite a large middle class. In a sense, the modal part of that population is middle class. By contrast, in the Eastern Cape, the middle class is very small. Elites are very small. The modal, over 70% of the population in the Eastern Cape is poor, absolutely poor. So insofar as middle classes exert more voice, you have more voice pressing for better performance in the context of the Western Cape. Also, for reasons that have to do with some distinctive histories and demographies across these two regions, the Western Cape has long been characterized by competitive politics. Two political parties, highly competitive elections, alternation between these parties and who gets to govern. The Eastern Cape, by contrast, has had a single dominant party throughout the 25 years of democracy, dominant in the sense that that party would win over 70% of the vote. So insofar as parties compete over their ability to provide and offer services, the Western Cape political competition on the demand side drives performance in a way that the Eastern Cape does not. So that's the demand side differences. Now let's look at the supply side differences. So one massive, massive difference is the inherited institutional legacy between the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape. I don't have time now to go through the details of this. Let me just offer you the following. Apartheid South Africa was to a very large degree a system which was organized around the systematic effort to fragment the polities, excepting for the polity of the ruling white elite. And the Eastern Cape was, in a sense, it got all that fragmentation. Within the Eastern Cape, you had multiple mini bureaucracies. The apartheid logic actually created multiple so-called independent states. They were governed on patronage lines. So when the Eastern Cape province is created at the end of apartheid, what is actually done is a whole series of dysfunctional, fragmented bureaucracies are put together. And the word goes out, congratulations, you're now the Eastern Cape province in the Eastern Cape Department of Education. Make your bureaucracy work. But it doesn't work that way because the inheritance is fragmented, patronage, very difficult to change. By contrast, the Western Cape, and again, I won't go into the details, inherits a coherent, largely using the sort of Weberian, a meritocratic functioning bureaucracy. So that supply side are massive, massive differences across the two provinces. Also, the way that the Eastern Cape comes together is it looks like single party dominance on the surface, but in practice it's not, because in practice, many political opportunists from the apartheid era decide they're going to join the electorally dominant ANC. The ANC itself, at deep, deep roots, this is the ruling party, is itself ideologically incredibly diverse, and all of that divergence is present inside the Eastern Cape. And so what you end up with is a system in the Eastern Cape that is overwhelmingly multi-stakeholder and personalized. This little 2x2 on the top is simply a schematic way of using the framework I introduced earlier to characterize the bureaucracy, and behind that, the politics. And that this bureaucratic dysfunction is deeply, deeply rooted in the historical context. It's deeply, deeply rooted in weak voice from the demand side. And the result is political fragmentation and ongoing contestation. It's a perfect storm of bureaucratic dysfunction shaped by a background politics that's extraordinarily messy. And indeed, an effort was made to turn this around from central government, and it turned out to be incredibly difficult because the politics are so deeply rooted. So what we get then is we see, so far I've described for you one of the two problems I want to address, the problem of political fragmentation in a stuck politics, which is the bottom left of this framework that we introduced in the first part of these talks, and the Eastern Cape is a classic example of it. I now want to talk about the problem on the bottom right, the problem of process compliance. And as you see here, I've flagged the Western Cape there. Now, you might be surprised by this, because what I've done up to now, I realize, is contrasted the Western Cape with the Eastern Cape, and I've described this seemingly high-performing, but at least hierarchical and impersonal bureaucracy. But there's a very, very interesting surprise. When we look at the performance of the Western Cape education system, not against South African comparators, but against Kenya, we discover that the Western Cape sharply underperforms Kenya, and sharply underperforms as the right point of comparison, Nairobi, Kenya, notwithstanding the fact that Kenya has much lower income. No one has ever accused Kenya of having a Prussian-style, top-down, high-performing, rule-bound bureaucracy. But nonetheless, Kenya outperforms the Western Cape. And once again, as part of the research, we did the econometrics, and we discovered that all of this is true when you hold constant the socioeconomic characteristics. So there's something going on about the Western Cape that when you lift your span of vision beyond other South African provinces, you say, wait, there's something of a problem here, and it's the problem that I've described as the problem of process compliance. And I've contrasted that, and this is, in a sense, setting us up for what I think and I hope will be an interesting discussion. I've contrasted that with Kenya, a setting where the bureaucracy is less coherent than the bureaucracy of the Western Cape, but for reasons that we will see in a moment, more aligned to learning, and it produces better outcomes. And so what we have then is we have two sets of problems. The first problem was the problem on the left-hand side. The second problem is this one, the problem of locked-in coherence, in this case around narrow control-oriented process compliance, short-circuiting top-down efforts to foster more learning-oriented education bureaucracies. And the question that we need to ask is, what is to be done? What can be done to improve learning outcomes? And now we're entering into the last part of what I wanted to share with you. And as you see the way I've set up this slide, I can't and I'm not going to try to offer you a comprehensive answer to the question, what is to be done to improve learning outcomes? I'm going to focus on a subset of the challenges of what might be done, a subset that derives, I think, in interesting ways from the way I've set up this framework. So things I'm not going to do. I'm not going to go through systematically which of the classic interventions to improve learning outcomes, middle circle interventions using the WDR framework, which of these classic interventions are nonetheless potentially doable and achievable. Not going to go through that, but it's an interesting, worthwhile exercise. Nor am I going to ask a broad question around what I summarized here as institutional pluralism, where there are other ways of organizing an education system than saying the system is a system of public schools within a public bureaucracy. In work that Lance Pritchard has done, he distinguishes between, rather evocatively, between what he calls spider and starfish systems, systems that have top-down logics versus systems that are more network systems. And there's a variety of range of options there. That is not my theme. My theme remains we're looking at a school system. It's essentially a public school system governed by a public bureaucracy. We run into some constraints that are shaped by politics. What might we do to respond and address these political constraints? And I'm going to flag in this last part of this two ways in which one might address that, corresponding to the two problems that we have already identified. The first problem is this one, summarizing it again here, the problem that a system is fragmented, and obviously it's fragmented and it's not aligned to learning. And in this fragmented system that's not aligned to learning, the political constraints block the possibility of saying, well, let's just make it more coherent, or let's just align it more to learning. So what can one do in such a system? And there is a paradox that emerges for a system like this. The paradox is that the very fragmentation of the system, a system it's fragmented, it lacks coherence, means that potentially at local levels within that system, there might be some space. To put that differently, there might be room for, in fragmented systems, for islands of effectiveness to emerge, notwithstanding the seemingly broader dysfunction of the system as a whole. And one way to look for those islands, and we did this in the South African research, is to go down to the school level. As you will have seen in the way I presented this earlier, the South African Schools Act, promulgated in 1996, put quite substantial power in the hands of school governing bodies. And so the question we wanted to ask was, what difference did that make? And so we went in depth. It's not large numbers, but small numbers in depth over time, looking at school level governance, school level learning outcomes, the interactions between them, how they were shaped by hyper-local school level politics. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what we discovered were mixed impacts. Sometimes the school level governance improved learning outcomes. Sometimes it was irrelevant. Sometimes school level governance provided a platform for capture. We can go beyond that. We also discovered that a proximate explanation for these variations are the relative strength at the local level of developmental and predatory actors. To put that differently, this is the logic, if you like, of an island of effectiveness. The question that comes up is, in a system that is fragmented, are you able at the local level to build coalitions of developmental actors that are sufficiently strong to be able to push back against predatory actors and enable that island to work effectively? And at least my interpretation of the school level results is indeed this might sometimes be possible. Maybe I asked the question, can this be proactively supported? Is this realistic? It's a view that is all very, very often met with skepticism. So this is my way of trying to think analytically about what is going on. If we think of this as a distribution of schools, we take all the schools within a particular area, call it the Eastern Cape if you like, call it, it can be anywhere, it can be a district in India, whatever this is. And if we think about those schools and we say in each of these schools there is some balance between developmental actors and predatory actors, and a school will not be oriented to learning if the predatory actors dominate, but it could be oriented towards learning if the developmental actors dominate. And so here you see two possible distributions between developmental and predatory actors. On the top graph, the blue graph says, well, it's a normal distribution. 50% of the schools tend to be more predatory, 50% of the schools tend to have more developmental actors. The bottom part of the graph says, no, that's not what it looks like. What it actually looks like is that the schools are overwhelmingly tilted to being captured by predatory actors. Now, if you are in that bottom graph, then the potential for getting gains by more participation is very, very low. It's very, very low because predation dominates and you can't break it. But if you're in the top graph and you say, and there are ways that one might do this, let us try to systematically empower the more developmentally oriented actors. Sometimes you'll succeed, sometimes you won't. But as that top graph, the red graph illustrates, if you succeed just some of the time, you can shift a fairly large fraction of schools from being more predatory towards being more developmental. Which of these applies is an empirical question, knowing that there will be variation. Notice also that the same logic between the balance between predatory and developmental actors, which I've laid out now at the level of the schools, that same logic also applies at the level of districts. So for example, some work I've seen on Ghana, you have tremendous variation across districts in the quality of school systems. And it's the same logic, because in some districts, you have coalitions of developmental actors that have been sufficiently strong that they are able to trump the predators. And by trumping the predators, they're able to build an islands of effectiveness. So this is the first entry point for change that I wanted to flag. The entry point for change that says in fragmented systems, there exists the possibility nonetheless of building islands of effectiveness. But that's only one of our two issues. What about the second problem that we identified earlier? The problem of the bureaucracy that is trapped in process compliance, or perhaps, well, I'm going to use, because it's the Western Cape example, the process compliant narrative could also be the problem of the patronage bureaucracy. How to unlock that? And to understand this, I'm going to come back to Kenya. I mentioned Kenya earlier. I flagged earlier how the Kenyan system surprisingly outperformed the Western Cape system, notwithstanding the fact that its bureaucracy is less coherent. And the question that we then puzzled on is, what is the secret sauce that enabled the Kenyan bureaucracy to perform as well as it did? These are just the data, again, just to remind you of the outperformance of Kenya in relation to the Western Cape. And here's what we learned about the secret sauce. This is from a man, Ben Piper, worked in Kenya for 15, 20 years, global guru on learning outcomes. And this is what he says about Kenyan systems. There are two aspects to the Kenyan secret sauce. And we're focusing here on results after 8 years of education, the Kenya Certificate of Primary Education. The first aspect is parents know how well their school is doing relative to other schools because the exam results are distributed broadly at the school level. Parents know if the school where their children are is a relatively high-performing or relatively weak-performing school. The second aspect, which is the one that is really, really striking, is that parents take this really, really seriously and they react. When their school does well, the principal gets a parade. If the school does badly, the parents pressure, often successfully, for the principal to be changed. So there's tremendous voice and participation coming through in the Kenyan school systems. Where does this come from in Kenya? So it's deeply, deeply rooted. This slide just summarizes that. And you see it clearly in the person of Jomo Kenyatta, who was a school teacher, political leader, embraces notions of participation as the key to a proud, independent Kenya, with learning as a crucial part of that. So what we see when we ask, what is Kenya's secret sauce? Kenya's secret sauce is, if you like, it is the idea of learning as a goal and of learning as everybody's responsibility. So let's contrast the Kenyan secret sauce with the South African circumstance. And again, there's more detail in the book on South Africa, but basically South Africa's approach to the education sector at every level has been narrowly top-down. The national level, preoccupation with plans. At the provincial level, preoccupation with fixing bureaucracies. At the school level, and there's a complex background story here, but notwithstanding the formal structure that empowers school governing bodies, in practice, excepting in elite schools, there's been essentially no effort to try to take that participatory structure and, in a sense, breathe life into participation, even in low-income communities. Contrast that with Kenya. Contrast that with the idea of what I call all for education, which the Kenyan example tells us can be an incredibly powerful countervailing force in the face of political fragmentation, in the face of patronage, in the face of a bureaucracy's propensity for rigidity. All of that, by the way, describes the Kenyan bureaucracy. And so it leads us, noting that these patterns are deeply rooted, noting that these patterns are hard to change, it leads us to ask the question, if a system is locked in process compliance, what role can ideas play to shift it? How can you move a system and remember what the task is. The system's in a low-level equilibrium of process compliance, as you see in the bottom right-hand side of the slide from the very beginning of these presentations. That equilibrium is a low-level equilibrium trap. Unlocking it means that one needs a collective realignment across multiple stakeholders. How can you shift ideas, back to that variable again, in relation to learning? So here's a summary. How might you move from that bottom right cell, if you like, up and to the left in the diagram? And it's the power of a transformative idea. The idea of, what I call here an all for learning political invitation, an invitation to active citizenship. The determined effort to create space in the system for learning-oriented innovators within the bureaucracy, among parents, communities, and NGOs, looking for ways to foster entry points for engagement, and, as we saw was also critical in the case of Kenya, measurement to distinguish schooling from learning. And so, to conclude, this explanation, I'm going to go back to the place where I began, which was the World Development Report's 2018 framework. And I'm going to depict here what a low-level equilibrium might look like. An equilibrium where the goal is not learning and learning outcomes, but patronage and patronage compliance. And what are its features? And here you see them. Politicians cultivating clientelistic networks of support. Bureaucrats where jobs are patronage and the culture is a compliance culture. Unions focus on jobs, power, and work conditions rather than a professional learning-oriented union. NGOs find it politically, it works better politically, although not necessarily better on learning outcomes, to engage in confrontation around infrastructure and rights rather than to go through the difficult work of what does it take to improve learning. And parents and communities are seen as, at best, helpless, at worst, just noise in the system, and they're marginalized. That's what a dysfunctional equilibrium looks like. And this is what a high-performing learning equilibrium might look like. It's a high-performing learning equilibrium where politicians champion learning, bureaucrats and unions engage with a learning-oriented engagement. It's a sense of mission and purpose around teaching and learning. NGOs support communities and their advocacy is built around learning outcomes. And parents and communities are engaged as partners in this learning effort at all levels, at all per capita incomes across the entire range. That then is the critical function, not of the fragmented system, where we've seen the stuck fragmented system ideas can help, but we look for islands of effectiveness, but the system that's trapped more broadly. The transformation is the transformation of ideas, the transformation from this low-level equilibrium to this equilibrium of shared commitment amongst all stakeholders around learning and an alignment that can lead, and in some countries has led, to sharply improved learning outcomes. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm grateful to the RISE program and the Consortium of Universities for inviting me to make this presentation. Thank you very much.